Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Proud. I'm the peacemonger. I'm delighted today to welcome Alexander Mercouris. He doesn't really take any introduction because he runs possibly the most successful geopolitics podcast that there is around. And if you don't already watch it, and I'm sure you do, then please do so with Alex Christoforou. That they make an excellent double act in dissecting the kind of key events of the day. Alexander, welcome.
Well, delighted to be here. First of all, Happy New Year to you, Ian. And may I say thank you for those very, very generous and kind words. And welcome to YouTube, by the way.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to you and your family as well. Alexander, the weekend, I quite like following George Osborne and Ed Balls have a podcast. The dynamic between them works well as former kind of Conservative and Labour cabinet ministers, and I think they have interesting discussions on political economy. But George Osborne has recently taken this, what one assumes is an extremely well-paid job at a big AI firm in San Francisco, and they got onto the topic of Greenland, and almost like a passing remark, George Osborne was saying, "Well, it's just a historical geographical anomaly anyway. So what's the fuss about?" Almost seeking to legitimize Trump's move to effectively annex Greenland against the wishes of the Danish government. I mean, what does it say about the wider kind of malaise in Euro elite discussion right now?
Well, I think you put it very well, actually. And I think you've written about it and you've discussed this. To my mind, what this increasingly looks like, I hate to use the word, it's so overused, but it does have a genuine smack of 1930s appeasement about it. I want to be very careful. I'm not suggesting that Donald Trump is Hitler or anything like that, but he's wanting straightforwardly for entirely American reasons to take over Greenland. There is no great demand in Greenland to be annexed by the United States. Greenland is well established sovereign territory. Denmark. Denmark is an ally of the United States. It is also, by the way, an ally of Britain, a country with which we have had a very long standing and very close relationship with, going back many centuries. Our royal family, for what it's worth, also has connections to the Danish royal family. Edward VII's wife, who is an ancestress of our present king and queen, was Danish. And yet, we say quite casually, this is just the Danes. It's an anomaly that they had this big territory sovereign to themselves, and it's no great big deal if Trump wants it. Almost the implication is, let him have it. We mustn't rock the boat. We mustn't destabilize our crucial relationship with the United States. Let him do what he wants, but let's not let ourselves get into a situation where we confront the Americans over this. And that says, well, it's firstly extraordinarily weak, but it also highlights the dangerous over-dependence on the United States, which as a country we have fallen into. We're not able to push back against something which is egregiously wrong, as this is. There's no conceivable threat to the United States from Greenland or anything of that kind of. The whole narrative about Russian, Chinese warships is an absurd one. So something egregiously wrong and something which in a way betrays an ally. I don't know what the Danes themselves are going to do, but I can't help but think that if there is a crisis over Greenland, if George Osborne gets his way, we will be pressuring the Danes to come to some kind of agreement with Trump so that he can get it.
Well, I worry that you're right, and Keir Starmer has been sort of worryingly equivocal on this issue so far. Of course, expressing his support for the Danish government, but nevertheless doing everything possible to not irritate Trump. And as with his position on Ukraine, I suspect that position will be untenable as events take their course. Now, the Munich analogy is always applied to
Mm,
Russia and Ukraine, of course, and I think it's incorrect. I mean, where it is, it's seldom helpful, I think, to make these analogies anyway, as you
yeah.
kind of implied a moment ago. But it seems much more relevant in this case, in circumstances where a great power is seeking permission, if you like, from other states to take land from a smaller, weaker nation. And yet, this doesn't seem to get mentioned, in the sort of contemporary discourse. And there's this exceptionalism about it, which is deeply surprising, in my view. Why do we kind of see big bad Russia as somehow more culpable than what is a much more relevant and extant analogy in the case of Trump.
Well, indeed. I mean, we don't want to need. We shouldn't perhaps delve too much into comparisons, and of course, there's a danger of appearing to justify things. But the Russians have a much stronger historical connection to the regions where the war is going on in eastern Ukraine, and they do have security concerns, which they take seriously. Greenland, it seems to me, is simply a case of somebody wanting, for their own reasons, to pursue expansion. There's no threat to the United States from Greenland. And as I said, Denmark does have all of these connections. Yet we take this very strong stance towards the Russians. We refuse to entertain that they have any reasons to think as they do at all. But where it comes to Greenland, we're prepared apparently to sit back and give it up. Even though, as I said, it's the Danes who are our friends and our allies, our actual allies, Ukraine and Britain. We are not formal allies of Ukraine. We are formal allies of Ukraine, and we are going along with that. Well, of Denmark, and we're going along with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, just as an aside, I mean the Russian ships thing is very much, I think, because really for more than the past decade, Russia has been looking to develop the Northern Sea route through Arctic waters, essentially to speed the transit of shipborne goods to Asia. With global warming, they see that as an opportunity. And I saw a graphic on X just the other day that charted an American equivalent going over the top of Greenland. Although the direct route across the Atlantic to Europe is I can't see how it necessarily makes sense. But that was quite an interesting sort of comparison. But I
Mm,
mean that's where when you talk about Russian ships, people think about submarines and sort of nasty things with guns. What I think they actually are talking about is Russia's development of this northern sea route.
mm,
There's an odd schizophrenia in all of this, of course, because of the deep concern that European leaders and British leaders have about Trump's rowing back from forever support to the war in Ukraine and to the Zelensky administration. We see this too in the kind of position that has been taken, of course, on the kidnapping of Maduro, a character that personally. I find little to approve of. But nevertheless, American actions represent an attack, on a sovereign nation that we have simply let pass. Again, not drawing the link to Ukraine. I wonder whether, because I think there are two theories. I mean, either can the Europeans are worried about a loss of significant economic benefit if Trump sort of pulls away from you, or they're worried about the loss of the US kind of security shield. I mean, there's this schizophrenia, why, we're really anti-Trump when it comes to Ukraine, but nevertheless complicit in his actions. I mean,
Well,
how do you see?
well, I think that the two are actually very closely connected. There's been a very, I think, very insightful article by Anatol Lieven, which has appeared, I think, on an Unheard, in which he said that one of the reasons we are so pusillanimous in relation to a topic like Greenland is because as a result of the policies we are taking over Ukraine, we have become more dependent, dangerously over dependent on the Americans, and are therefore very, very frightened of arguing with them, of actually saying something that might make the Americans, who are already disinclined or becoming increasingly disinclined to support us in the very hardline policies that we're taking over Ukraine, might make them even more disinclined to support us and might indeed cause them to walk away. So the result is that we're taking this extraordinarily accommodating stance to the Americans over Greenland, over Venezuela, over who knows what else, precisely because we don't want to quarrel with the Americans, because we're so obsessed, so concerned, so alarmed about the situation in Ukraine. The option, the alternative to seek an end to the war and to recover some of our diplomatic maneuver space, our ability to behave more independently and more assertively in defense of what perhaps are equally important interests closer to home, that, of course, appears to be ruled out. In fact, we continue to go in the opposite direction, just as our objective appears to be to accommodate Trump in everything that he demands, in all sorts of other places, so that we can keep him committed and on side with respect to Ukraine. What we're actually trying to do is to get him even more on side over Ukraine, so that we end up becoming more dependent upon him still. So, yes, there is a disjunction. It is a paradox. But if you understand that it's this overriding focus that we have on Ukraine that is leading us in this direction, I think you find the key to the paradox.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Europe in particular, but the UK to a lesser extent, has developed a single issue foreign policy.
Yes.
And I think that that is, arguably driving the sort of the rise in nationalism, if you want to call it that, across Europe as a whole, including in the major powers, including, of course, in Britain, with Nadine Zahawi today announcing that he's going over to reform, as well. As it relates to kind of, Trump, I mean, he seems to be much more multi-vector, if you want to even call it that. He's spinning lots of different foreign policy plates, and we're only spinning one, and it's quite a small and fragile one. And we're that is, the war in Ukraine is a one-way street. I mean, that is not going to be won. It's not going to be won by Ukraine, and it isn't going to be won by Europe, and Britain against Russia. And Trump knows that. And I think it's, I think, I don't know what you think, Alexander, but I think it's delusional to believe that somehow miraculously Trump is going to have a change of heart, and that we're buying, or we're increasing the possibility of him doing so by stepping aside while he undertakes all of these egregious acts, against international law. I think it's completely delusional that
Well,
that
I,
this is happening.
I think you're absolutely correct. First of all, I don't think that there is anything that we can do that is going to make Donald Trump change his stance. I mean, he long ago made a decision that Ukraine is not a priority for the United States, and he would prefer, if anything, to have, as the security strategy review document said, some kind of stable relationship with the Russians. I think that is his view. I think, by the way, he's not the only person in Washington who holds it. I don't think the policy there is going to change either on Trump's part or anyway in the longer term. But I think what it's also doing is something else, which is it makes Trump feel, and we're talking about Trump the individual, I think he feels increasingly contemptuous and disrespectful to us in Europe, because he sees that we sign up to anything he wants, however extraordinary and reckless it might be. And so that, given that we're talking about Donald Trump, is going to make him more likely to test the waters in other places. He's seeing what we're saying about Greenland, for example. Maybe he's saying to himself, well, if I actually do decide simply to send the American army into Greenland and to annex Greenland, not even go through the charade of a negotiation with the Danes, well, I don't need to worry about it because I know in advance that the Europeans and the British will say a few things, but in the end they'll do nothing. So it's very bad that things are being done in this way. And you're absolutely right. Trump does have a much more multi-vector diplomacy and foreign policy than we do, as you would expect the United States. But so amazingly do the Russians. Now, for the Russians, Ukraine, of course, is their main overriding strategic priority because they're at war there. But it doesn't prevent them from pursuing other foreign policy interests that they also have around the world. They're developing their relations with all sorts of countries. They're active in all sorts of places. And we, by contrast, by being so narrowly and fixedly fixed on one issue, are losing the ball everywhere, or at least we're at risk of that. And so it seems to me. So I don't think American policy is going to change. I don't think Donald Trump is going to change his views. I think that in relation to Europe, what we're doing is going to harden his views, his already pre-existing views about us, which are increasingly disrespectful and lacking in any sense that we are partners, as opposed to people who will agree to whatever it is he wants on any other issue, which his mind lightens on, falls upon.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a sense of I often do actually Groundhog Day, when thinking about this, because among their multi-vector policy, the Russians, of course, are trying to kind of reset economic, but also political, but principally economic relations with the United States of America. And Trump appears increasingly to be buying into that. And I say it feels like Groundhog Day, firstly, because Trump looked to do the same thing, and the Russians, reciprocated during his first term, but he met, insufferable resistance, on the Hill in Washington at that time with Russiagate and everything else. But also, actually, the Russians, were keen to kind of engage economically with European states and say, well, we'll park the Ukraine. Let's not talk about Ukraine. Let's just do economic engagement. And I think that it's that same kind of maneuver. I think cleverly we're seeing from the Russians, right now with the Americans who see considerable economic benefit in re-engaging with Russia, particularly in the energy field. But not only that. I mean, the big loser here, as always, is again, Europe. Because you know, Trump wants both his cakes and to eat them, eat all
Yes,
three.
yes, yeah, that's exactly right. And he's achieving it. I mean, he is negotiating with the Russians. The Russians are making these proposals. If we go back to what was the situation in his first term, one does get the sense that the mood in the United States has changed, has shifted, that there is more willingness, even on the part of the wider political establishment, to entertain the ideas of some kind of economic relationship with the Russians than would have been true, say, in 2017, when it was first presented and it was a huge shock. So Trump is getting his way, but we, by contrast, by focusing so narrowly on the topic of Ukraine, what we're risking is that we're not going to end up with any cake at all, because we are not winning in Ukraine, despite what some people like to believe. In fact, we're not going to win in Ukraine. And we are contaminating, we're damaging our relations with the Americans. And we are losing we're losing options, we're losing opportunities in all sorts of other places where we could play a constructive and useful role, the Middle East, for example, at the same time. So this really doesn't make much sense to me. And I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to just kill the analogy a bit further about the cake, it's almost like the Europeans have got all the ingredients for the cake, but they can't afford to bake it because the gas is too expensive.
Very good.
And that is really the crux of it. I mean, Europe is in decline in large part because it's cut itself off from cheap energy.
Yeah.
That is by far the biggest reason for Europe's economic. I mean, obviously, it's never fully recovered from, the consequences of the global financial crisis, of course, but then you could say that about the US too. But the difference is that the US has access to plentiful, cheap energy and we don't. And I think that has been the thing that is materially different. That as an act of policy, we're choosing to deindustrialize, in Europe. And of course, in the UK, even though we were never in the UK reliant on, Russian gas, we're so connected to Europe that we feel the pain of it, anyway. I mean, at what point does somebody in Europe step up and say, well, let's buy cheap Russian gas?
Well, I'm so glad you said this because so far this discussion barely takes place. It's taking place to a certain limited extent in Germany, though even there, anybody who brings that topic up in the way that you've just done is going to meet a very, very aggressive and hostile reaction. But in general, pointing out that the proximate cause to our current economic problems in Europe. I'm talking about the proximate cause. There are many other longer term problems as well that have built up over many, many years. But the proximate cause over the last few years is this disruption of energy flows and this decision that we took to cut ourselves off from the simple, straightforward, reliable source of energy that was coming into Europe and which was making our industries, or at least Germany's industries, which are the key industries, competitive. This is the proximate cause of the crisis. Nobody wants to address this. To the extent that they do, you get these strange articles which say that it was a terrible mistake for the Germans to become so dependent on Russian gas, and now they're suffering from some kind of withdrawal symptoms because they've given up importing that Russian gas. And that proves that they were completely wrong to buy that Russian gas in the first place. So deindustrialize in order to make your economy, healthy and strong again. I mean, it's a very strange kind of logic, at least to me. But it is the logic that we are adopting. We don't really want to wrestle and address this issue at all.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians have a saying, "Деньги не пахнут," which means money doesn't smell. And I've always taken the view uh, that actually, at the basis of European power that has enabled it to wield diplomatic clout globally has been its economic strength, um, caused by the opening up of economic relations between the member states, within that community and wider connections across Eurasia, of course, into Russia too. It isn't, I don't see the Europe has, as a bloc, as an institution, has politics as its inner strength. I mean that, in fact, politics is the essential kind of dividing factor, the factor that causes dissent and causes unrest across the bloc in the way that economics does not, in my sense, and people have lost sight of that. And I think actually that, as power has centralized in Brussels, increasingly, and as the nation state has developed a quieter voice in decision making, the economics have fallen by the wayside as people have grappled for a much bigger political role that has never really existed in the past and can only be unhelpful now. I mean, what's your view?
You are You're absolutely correct, and you can give there's a very obvious and simple illustration of the fact. I mean, because obviously, I mean, people will say, well, Europe has the political strength, and it's had economic strength, and it's had cultural strength too. And culture is what people turn to Europe for. You could have made exactly that same argument. In fact, once upon a time, it was made in the 18th century, for example. It was made about China. China had this enormous soft power, as we would call it today, across Eastern Asia. And then, of course, its economy went into decline. It fell behind. It was no longer economically strong. In fact, it became economically very weak. And what happened to its soft power? It dissipated. Yeah, it is only now when China's economy has grown stronger again that we see its soft power, its cultural magnetism start to attract people. I mean, it's a painful thing to admit. And bear in mind, my aunt was a minister of culture, so it'd be particularly difficult for someone like me to admit. But cultural exports only take you so far. Ultimately, it is economics. It is power. It is the sense that you're economically successful, that you have a ability to produce a life that other people aspire to have also. That determines your place in the international system. And unfortunately, what's happened in Europe over the last 20 years is that we seem to have lost sight of that. Now, you mentioned the European Union, and here I must say, I mean, I think very much like yourself, I am somebody who, for most of my adult life, nearly all my adult life, was a very strong supporter of what we call the European Union today. And I still maintain that in the 60s and 70s, when I was young, it was an absolute positive. I think it created peace. It did secure peace. It did secure very considerable economic growth. It made economic conditions much better. Um, where it began to go wrong was when it lost that focus on trade and economics and living standards and making people in Europe not just richer, but happier in all the ways that happens when a country, when a place is economically successful. When it began to fall into the trap, and it was an easy trap, it's understandable how it came about, of thinking itself as a place that had some kind of not just political, but geopolitical purpose, which I think was a terrible mistake and has led it completely down the wrong path to this awful state that we're in today.
Yeah, I completely agree, Alexander. And actually, talking about culture, it really does make me think how this links to the erosion of the nation state, actually, within Europe right now, because China is a single state, but it's culturally incredibly diverse within itself, as is, in fact, Russia, as you know, and as is Europe. I mean, different countries, different languages, language groups, different history, culture, and all of that. But that helped to feed the economic strength, I think, of Europe through comparative advantage. Different countries and cultures brought different things to the economic table, and that made the economic interplay between them more vibrant, if you like, in a helpful way. And this geopolitical role, to me at least, it seems to emerge from a drive to culturally homogenize Europe internally within itself through this excessive focus on values. I mean, as an aside, I can walk down my street and talk to 10 people and find probably 10 different sets of values, among them. I just don't think that kind of really works. But I mean, I think that drive to homogenize cultures and actually create this unifying set of values is something that is very much a key ingredient in this push for a geopolitical role, where we try and impose our value-based normative view of how other countries should run their affairs on the rest of the world.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, one can explore this all sorts of ways. I mean, we could point out, that there used to be a French car industry, and a German car industry, and a British car industry. Each of them had very distinctive characteristics. I mean, British cars were heavy, and well, they were very good for difficult roads. German cars had their own engineering style. French cars had a completely different design philosophy.
Style.
Italian cars had their flair. But I mean, the point was they all competed with each other, and they all offered people different things. And it was interesting. And the same in culture. I mean, I'm very interested in classical music. I listen to a lot. French orchestras used to play music differently from the way German orchestras did. And again, it was interesting, and it added to something. Conformity in Europe, which is what we talk about when we end up talking about values, we tend to stick to one particular set of group of values that everybody must share, even when people have different values which ultimately complement each other. I mean, French law is different from British law, but that doesn't mean that they are diametrically opposed to each other. They just think and do certain things differently, but the interchange between the two, the interconnections between the two, are interesting and attractive. I speak as somebody who used to work a lot with French lawyers in the past, so I came across this. Trying to impose a conformity in Europe, when it was precisely our diversity that gave us energy and dynamism and made us so attractive to others, and explains why we have, different cities, different places, why Paris and Berlin and London are all of them great capitals, but all different from each other. I think that was a mistake. I think this has been a mistake, and it has led us into a foreign policy that has deprived us also of the diplomatic talents that each of our countries used to have. That Britain had very distinctive style of doing diplomacy. Maybe as a person from a small country, European country, Greece, I'm more aware of this. But it was always, we used to talk about the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, and we were always conscious that each of these countries did things somewhat in their different ways, but it was always interesting, and it was always made a difference. And it meant that if somebody preferred the one to the other, there was always the option to choose.
Yeah, I mean, and I think actually one of the reasons that diplomatically, we have weakened ourselves is through the erosion of cultural curiosity, this desire to understand the countries in which we operate by getting out of buildings, talking to people there, knowing the language, and an excessive focus on the policy sausage machine, where we spend all our time talking to capitals, in my case, in London, about policy. But it's that policy is built on sand because nobody is actually trying to understand the country, in which they are operating. And that goes, and thank you for prompting the thought. I mean, that goes right to the heart, I think, of why diplomatically we are becoming a bit of a minnow, frankly, internationally, particularly since Brexit, whatever the arguments, both sides of the Brexit debate may be, especially following, the election of Trump, where we seem to be cast further adrift into the Atlantic with no anchors.
I think that's absolutely correct. Again, diplomacy, foreign policy, well, not almost, by definition, requires getting to know the other side, getting to know what they're all about. Again, if you look at, say, British foreign policy in the 19th and early 20th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, which I know very well because it is absolutely part of my Greek history. I mean, the British knew the Ottoman Empire. They went. If you know how British diplomats worked in that world, you would know how exactly it was in the way that you described. One of the most famous British representatives of all, Lawrence of Arabia, used to go around wearing Arab clothes, for example, and learn to speak the language, and met all of those people. And he was not the only one by any means. There is a Scottish part of my family, and that comes from the fact that a British diplomat based in Greece became very assimilated into Greek culture and married my great-great-grandmother, just to say.
Marvelous. And I love all of the texture that those kind
Yeah.
of relationships, in history bring to the story about how different countries intersect, with each other. On the Scottish, I mean, I often marveled at the fact that Scottish architects built the walls to the Kremlin, in Moscow,
Yeah.
for example. But you're right. I mean,
And designed Catherine the Great's gardens. If you
yeah,
go to St. Petersburg, the gardens are all designed by Scotsmen,
yeah.
and many of her buildings are.
The last diplomatic function I ever attended was to often a address at the Caledonian Society of St. Petersburg's slightly late St. Andrew's Day ball, which was frankly a fabulous event at the Astoria, hotel. But even that had all these Russian people in tartan doing Scottish reeling until about 5 or 6 in the morning. It's doing a bit, but I mean, diplomatically, the Russians are just very, very different from us, Brits. They have a very peculiar and very dry and sharp sense, about them, which we just don't or can't, I think is more correct to say, engage with. And I saw the Russian ambassador, about an article I'm writing at the moment on UK-Russian diplomatic relations a few weeks ago, and this past weekend I went to Torquay with my son to grade for our black belt, and I'm pleased to say that we both passed, and very proud of my son. I am too. And 2 weeks ago, as I'm finishing my discussion with the ambassador, he's showing me out of his very fine residence. And I say, well, do you ever escape this prison? Because, nobody talks to him in Whitehall, and he's kind of stuck in his residence for a lot of the time. He says, no, I travel around England quite a lot. I really like it. There's some towns I really like. I said, well, are there any towns you like in particular? He said, yes. Yes, I like Torquay. Not Turkey. Torquay. I thought, yeah, they know their adversary, the Russians. They study us in the way that we just do not study them, and it's just another. I told my wife, and
Yeah.
she just burst out laughing when I sort of mentioned it to her that he's sort of just thrown this into the conversation like Columbo at the end as we were leaving. It was a fascinating insight. But, I mean, I think the ugly truth that the European leaders struggle to kind of face up with, and to go back to the earlier point on sort of comparative advantage and cultural kind of diversity, is actually that the Russian energy is part of what used to be, within the melting pot of comparative advantage within that wider European
Yeah.
economic space. And of course, Russia brought its own very specific but also very rich, cultural hinterland, into that discussion as well, in ways which were helpful in terms of mutual understanding, through Bolshoi Ballet performing, in Covent Garden, and that sort of thing. And it's that, I think, that we've also kind of missed somewhere along the way, and people struggle to see that.
Well, one of the things that I have to say again, speaking as a Greek, is this failure to think of Russia as a European country. To a Greek, it is axiomatic that Russia is part of Europe. It is an absolutely central part of Europe. I spoke about how I'm partly descended from a British diplomat, but another one of my ancestors actually served as consul for the Russian Empire in the court of Turin. I mean, they were absolutely integrated into our cultural world and our history. And so much of our own culture is being enriched by their culture. You know, their music, for example, that you mentioned, their ballet, all of this, their literature, which is played a huge role in us in our developing our own culture. And by the way, um, their literature was also influenced by ours. People like Tolstoy, for example, read George Eliot, and Dostoevsky read Dickens. So this extraordinary barrier that we've created between us and them has done enormous damage. And yes, absolutely, they do have their own way. They do have their own way of conducting diplomacy, which is different from ours. You've discussed this many times. By the way, just to say, your book about your time as a diplomat in Moscow, it highlights many of the differences in diplomacy between their style of diplomacy and our style of diplomacy. Their approach is often much more bombastic than ours tends to be. But once you get through that, and you can get through that, you find that the commonalities are indeed there, and the points where you could find the meeting place are there. And that is what diplomats do. So we do share a common European cultural language of all of the current great powers in the world. Given that, we ought to be able to find some way with them. It's extraordinary that we can't. And I can't help but think that a lot of the problems are exactly because of what you experienced, that people stay in their embassies, they don't go out there, they circulate the same articles and ideas amongst each other. People read in the Financial Times what looks to them to be interesting, what accords with their own preconceived ideas. They then regurgitate it back to London, and it all goes round in a circle, and we lose sight of the real place and of the real policy that is there. If I'm going to say this, if there'd be more diplomats like you, there would not have been a crisis in Ukraine in the first place. It was a completely avoidable crisis. We could have absolutely found a way. There have been far more intractable and difficult crises over the course of European history than that. And we, the Russians and the Ukrainians, also had certain fundamental shared interests which could have built on with each other, and we would have avoided this whole situation in which we are in now.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think there's still a possibility for that right through to the end of 2017. Actually, when relations were still fairly open between both sides. Unlike now. I mean, what one final point I'd like to touch on briefly, because you sparked my thinking about this when you mentioned Greece was the role of orthodoxy in helping to kind of cast Russia as the other, the undesirable other, and this kind of odd move, in Ukraine, it seems to me, to kind of almost slightly abandon orthodoxy and take on the trappings of Catholicism, if you like, or Protestantism, by changing of their calendars and the dates of their Christmas, and the alienation of the Russian Orthodox church. I mean, to what extent do you see religion as just another way for us to kind of cast Russia out as the other, coming from Greece, where obviously orthodoxy is a key part of your cultural landscape?
Well, we have our own history with the Russians, which is very different from that of the British. I mean, the Russians were instrumental in helping Greece to gain independence from the Ottomans. So there was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s. And out of that, Greek independence emerged, basically. So we've had that interactions with them. I mean, it's not widely known, but in the second third of the 19th century, we were essentially, we were very, very closely allied with the Russians. And the first prime minister of independent Greece was a Greek who had previously served as Russia's foreign minister and had represented Russia at the Congress, along with Alexander the Tsar, and another person who was simultaneously also serving as Russian foreign minister. But this Greek man had actually been foreign minister of Russia for a time. So we've had those very close interconnections with the Russians, and orthodoxy obviously does play a significant role. I think, and this is my own view, that it is a little overstated. Focusing on orthodoxy makes Russia seem less like the rest of Europe than, in my opinion, it actually is. It makes it seem distinctive and different in ways that it actually isn't really. I mean, orthodoxy is a Christian. It is a Christian denomination. It's part of the Christian world. And that inevitably makes us much closer to each other, in Europe than, say, people who followed a completely different non-Christian faith would be. So I think this is overstated. But what I do think has happened in Ukraine is slightly different, which not slightly, is very different in the sense that they have repudiated the link to Russian orthodoxy as part of a general movement within Ukraine to deny the very strong connection to Russia that they actually have. So they won't speak the language. They will tear down the statues of Russian cultural figures who once upon a time they might have seen as their own cultural figures. They rename cities in ways that, again, seem to be intended to distance them from, the historic Russian connections. They are, in effect, trying to find an identity for themselves, which is completely different from the Russian identity, from the identity that was very close to Russia, which they previously had. Now, at a certain level, you can understand that, but I think it's a dangerous thing for us to encourage. And when the Maidan revolution took place in 2014, we tended to discourage it. Now we have drifted into such an anti-Russian position altogether that we are sort of colluding with it. You can see that in some of our media now, which talks about Ukraine pursuing a policy of decolonization, which is somehow commendable. And we are almost falling into the trap of doing the same thing. So, we are relabeling paintings by people like Ivazovsky, for example, as Ukrainian rather than Russian, even though Ivazovsky's connections to Ukraine are not particularly strong, just to say. I mean, he was Armenian ultimately, I believe. And Prokofiev, I've seen him described as a Ukrainian composer, which would have surprised Prokofiev, just to say. So probably they'll be doing the same as Stravinsky at some point. Anyway, this is, I think, extremely dangerous territory for us to fall into. And of course, it connects us to certain forces inside Ukraine, which I think we would be wise to keep a distance from. So this is what. It's a complicated answer to your question, but I see the rebellion, if you like, the turning away from Russian Orthodoxy. You should say there are many orthodoxies.
Yes,
Greek
yes, I know.
Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy are not exactly the same. This turning away from Russian Orthodoxy, it seems to be, is only a part of a deeper process that is taking place inside Ukraine, which, as I said, has its explanations, but I think we should be treating a lot more carefully and perhaps a lot more critically than we in fact are.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I kind of tend to think that the Ukrainians under Zelensky are trying to kind of put on this mantle of Europeanness
Mm.
in terms of identity, which doesn't actually exist, which takes us back to the earlier point about the cultural diversity within
Yes,
the different states of Europe itself. And the only people they're pleasing in doing this are the likes of Kaya Kallas and Ursula
yeah,
von der Leyen and possibly Keir Starmer,
yeah.
as well. And I think it's deeply unhelpful. But all of this brings me back to Ukraine being this massive, um, you know, block in the road of any sort of normalization of relations with Russia. The only way we can start to rebuild over a period, I suspect, of some decades, the diversity of Europe, the interconnectedness of Europe, the economic strength of Europe, is to end the war in Ukraine. And the longer we allow it to run on, the longer we appease, Trump, in the hopes that that will keep it running along. The further down the road we push back this normalization, which I think can only benefit, European citizens as a whole. I mean, and by Europe, I mean writ large, including, of course, Russia.
Well, you're absolutely correct in the sense, and there's a further point here because the breakdown in relations between the rest of Europe and Russia, and by the way, about Ukraine, establishing an European identity, uh, uh, almost by definition, that requires Ukraine to deny Russia's European identity. To the extent that we are embracing that, we're ending up denying Russia's European identity also. And in fact, you see this all over much of the commentary at the moment. And as I said, I think that's wrong at multiple levels, and it is weakening Europe as well. But going back to your point, yes, to the extent that the crisis in Ukraine is the roadblock and was to some extent the starting point of the deep crisis that we have now, it is also the route back in the sense that if we start to talk with the Russians about Ukraine, and I mean, I say we, I mean the Europeans, if we start doing that and try finally to find a way forward, a good faith way forward, which apparently the Minsk agreement was not, which anyway, we won't talk about it. But if we do that, then through finding a way forward over Ukraine, we could find a way forward in general to sort out our relations with them and to benefit Europe also. In other words, to end this rupture that we find in Europe, which is weakening us and weakening us terribly. The worst possible outcome for Europe would be a Russian military victory without a diplomatic settlement that solidifies this crisis in Europe and makes it indefinite and unresolvable in any proximate sense. I mean, that would be a catastrophe, and we are dangerously close to it. And it's what we ought to be striving to avoid in every possible way that we can. Unfortunately, we are doing the diametric opposite. I mean, you sent me a paper before we did this program about proposals to send European troops to Ukraine and various other negotiated things that we do. This is wrong at multiple levels, in the sense, and this paper sets out all of the immediate dangers that would exist from that. But to the extent, again, that it solidifies the conflict, it freezes the conflict. We should not be aiming to freeze the conflict. We should be aiming for a resolution, an actual satisfactory resolution, satisfactory for us, for the Ukrainians, for the Russians, which can start to heal Europe's divisions, find a way back, and provide a pathway for Europe itself to reverse its decline into diplomatic and foreign policy irrelevance that you were talking about before, but also to find a way to reverse this economic decline, which is weakening Europe in all of these different ways, and which is throwing up all of these political movements across Europe, which threaten ultimately its internal stability.
Alexander Mercouris, absolutely fascinating and rich conversation there. It's been terrific talking to you, catching up again. It's been a while since we've spoken. Thank you so much for taking the time. I didn't realize we'd end up focusing on Kofiev and Torquay and all sorts of different things. We've covered a lot of ground, but it's been a really terrific conversation. So I just wanted to thank you very much and hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
I would be absolutely delighted, and I'm confident that we will.
Thank you.